सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The G20 Leaders Summit is finally upon us. After a full year of other meetings across the country where finance ministers, external affairs ministers, defense ministers have all met and discussed various issues, finally the leaders of all of these 20 countries, or most of these 20 countries, are going to meet in Delhi and finalize whatever has been decided over the last 1 year. Now, of course, these countries, they have a lot of, geopolitical issues to talk about, cultural issues to talk about. There are a lot of things that tie these countries together. But one big thing, of course, are the economic relations between all of these countries. So what the economic issues are before the G20 that will likely be discussed during the summit, that's what we're going to discuss in this episode of Macrosutra. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint. And we have with us Radhika Pandey, Associate Professor at NIPFP. Thank you, Radhika, for joining us. So now, Radhika, let's start with just listing out what the economic issues are before the G20 and what they're likely to discuss in the summit.
Yeah, so they have already made it very clear that they are going to discuss developmental issues.
Right.
And at the very outset of the G20 meetings, the very small meeting, India had said that it's going to champion the cause of the global south,
Right.
particularly the countries that have been affected due to COVID, due to geopolitical disruptions, various kinds of inflation, food, energy prices, etc., and that have caused a lot of new set of economic challenges for these countries.
Right.
So they will try to address the issues of the global south in these meetings. So India has made it very clear that it's going to use the G20 platform to address some of the issues which the G20 economy, the global south economies are facing.
Right.
Now, here when we look deeper into what are the issues, one of the main issues is the debt distress.
Okay.
Debt distress is particularly after COVID that has increased manifold for these smaller countries, and we can talk about in detail.
Right.
But just in terms of listing, one is the debt distress that there could be some consensus or some statement about time-bound resolution of debt of these countries.
Right.
So that is one. The second is on multilateral development banks, particularly the big multilateral development banks like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. There is this recognition that they need to step up their financing. Again, particularly for the global south, because these countries are facing new set of challenges. They have to be given additional funding for dealing with the new kind of challenges like climate change. So how to step up the financing by multilateral development banks.
Okay.
So that is second. And third is on cryptocurrency. Because we have seen a lot of countries have been issuing regulations for cryptocurrency, disparate set of regulations, different, the instruments for regulations are different.
Right.
And also the various standard setting bodies like IMF, the Financial Stability Board, they have also come up with their perspective on how to regulate, what are the threats and how to regulate cryptocurrency. Now, what India is saying is that we need to have more consistent and coordinated set of regulations on cryptocurrencies that particularly addresses the concerns of emerging economies, because emerging economies may face some additional challenges which the advanced economies may not be facing. So the regulation should be such that they are more tailored to address the additional set of challenges that emerging economies or developing economies may face. That is number 3.
Right.
And number 4 is digital public infrastructure, which India has been a success story. We know in terms of various instruments like the CoWIN, the UPI, Aadhaar, how through digital public infrastructure, the benefits of various welfare schemes have been made available to the poorest of the poor. acting as an instrument of financial inclusion. So India wants to showcase this and also try to make this, make some steps towards making this digital public infrastructure interoperable. So that is another proposal that India would like to take it to the G20 platform, though there are some resistance from advanced economies. So basically these are the four, in addition to geopolitical, but those are what India has said, that they will first focus on the developmental issues and then talk about, say, other geopolitical problems, Russia-Ukraine war, inflation and other things. But these are the four key issues on which we should see some statements coming out of the G20 Leaders Summit.
Right. So let's take these issues one by one.
Right.
Let's start with the debt distress, because that's something that is actually quite serious.
Right.
So what is the issue, and what are the possible solutions that they can work out during the summit?
Yes. So the issue is that the debt of the emerging economies and developing economies has increased manifold since COVID. And so there is a very interesting document which is released by the World Bank. It's called International Debt Statistics Report. So what it says is that the debt has increased to now $9 trillion. The outstanding debt of emerging markets and developing economies has increased to $9 trillion, which is a lot, and it's risen more so after COVID because of rising interest rates and slowing economic growth and collapse of revenues. So a lot of countries, around 60% of these developing countries are in debt distress. That means they are not able to repay their debt on a timely basis.
Yeah, because this 9 trillion is likely larger than the GDPs of these countries, right?
Yes, yes. So that is the reason that these are very small economies like Ghana, Ethiopia, African countries, Sri Lanka, Nepal. So there the debt has increased and therefore something needs to be done. Now, during the COVID time, an initiative was set up to create some form of suspension of debt. But then it was a very temporary phenomenon, and then during within the G20 platform, a new system which is called the Common Framework was set up for restructuring of debt. Now, what happens within the common framework is that if a country is facing debt distress, it can ask for, it can seek a request under the common framework. So it's part of the G20 platform. So if a country is facing a debt distress, it can request for restructuring of debt under the common framework. Restructuring can be in the form of extending the duration of the loan, reducing the interest rate, or some of the lenders taking a haircut. That means they do not get that much what they have lent out. So there could be various instruments of resolving or restructuring of debt. So so that is the instrument. But the problem that has arisen is that the composition of lenders or the composition of creditors has also changed. Earlier, what used to happen was that, it's either the IMF, the World Bank, or a set of countries that are called the Paris Club. The advanced economies, the UK, US, Australia, Canada, these were the countries who were the major lenders. So they were all together, and it was easier to come up with a consensus on how to resolve debt. Now what is happening is that the creditor composition has become more diversified.
Is this because of China?
Because of China. So that is the thing, that now China has become the biggest lender. It has surpassed the multilateral development bank like IMF and World Bank. It has surpassed the Paris Club countries taken together. So it is the biggest lender. And bringing China on board on this committee of creditors who will decide how to resolve the debt is becoming problematic. So it is causing a lot of delays. The thing is that China wants that these multilateral development banks should also be part of the committee of creditors like IMF and World Bank. They should also take haircuts. So there is a kind of friction which is already there, between China and the Paris Club countries, and that friction is more visible when they, sit on table to discuss the issue, the nuances of debt restructuring. So that is causing a lot of problems for these countries because already they are in debt distress, and further the economy facing a bad time because the debt distress is rising. Timely resolution is not happening. So countries like Chad, Ethiopia, Ghana, these are the countries which applied for debt restructuring, and Zambia, these were the countries that applied for debt restructuring under the common framework. Chad was first country that got some kind of debt restructuring, and now recently Zambia has got under India's G20 presidency.
Okay.
That the creditors have agreed to something.
Okay.
But the point remains that it's getting very lengthy, and the common framework is losing its relevance until and unless it becomes more timely. So that is something which India would like to talk about, discuss, that how to make debt resolution more timely. Should it have some timelines? What should be, how the issues need to be ironed out. So if something could be done on this, it will be a great achievement for India on the G20 platform.
But without the Chinese leader coming, that might be a little bit problematic. But they have their representatives there.
They have their representatives, and the other thing is that they have set up more institutions. They have set up something called the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, in collaboration with the IMF and World Bank. So at least there's some development in terms of having greater communication and discussion in this field. So if not now, maybe later on, at least some steps have been initiated.
Absolutely.
At least some discussion is going on that, this is a problematic area, and the global south debt distress needs to be taken more seriously, and it needs to be resolved more effectively and much more faster.
So I'm guessing then that the reforms that are needed for the multilateral development banks, which is the second issue you talked about, that is related to this?
Absolutely. Right. It's linked to this because, as we say, if you look at the report of the International Debt Statistics, it tells us, one, that the debt of these smaller countries has increased. The other thing it talks about is that the creditor composition has changed, with China emerging as the biggest lender. So in other words, it means that the pace of disbursements by these multilateral development banks, like the IMF, the World Bank, has not kept pace with the growing funding requirements of these countries. And these funding requirements are not just limited to the developmental mandate, that is addressing poverty, inequality, but it needs to now expand beyond the traditional remit of the multilateral development banks to cover areas like climate change, to help them meet the sustainable development goals of health, education, and so on. So for that, what happened that in the G20, we had the Indian G20 presidency set up an independent expert group under the chairmanship of N.K. Singh, who was also chairman of the Finance Commission, and Larry Summers. So their mandate was to suggest ways on how these multilateral development banks can step up their financing. How much more financing is needed, and if more financing is needed, how that finance will come, because that requires changing the operational framework of these multilateral development banks, their capital. Also, that would affect the advanced economies because they are the major shareholders of World Bank and IMF. So that is another important area of reform that will be discussed, that is being discussed in the finance tracks. Even on the 5th and 6th, the finance deputies met, and they are also talking about how to reform the multilateral development banks. And this independent expert group did submit its first volume of the report, which says that MDBs, these multilateral banks, need to step up their financing by $3 trillion annually. Whatever they are giving, they have to increase it by $3 trillion annually, of which 1.8 is for climate change and 1.2 is for education and other sustainable development goals. So these are challenges which, again, if there is some consensus on, how to reform the multilateral development banks, how to enhance their capital so that for each unit of capital they are lending more, what kind of risk management framework they need to take, are they being too conservative and not lending too much? So these are the issues on which this is another set of issues that will be discussed in the G20 meeting.
And so now coming to cryptocurrency, which I'm sure a lot of the viewers watching will be very interested in. India's held off on coming up with its own regulations, saying that it's going to wait for some sort of consensus, international regulation to come out. So now How close are we to seeing such an international regulation?
Yeah, so we have made progress because, as I said, many countries have developed their own frameworks. And what India has been emphasizing is that there needs to be a more coordinated and consistent approach towards crypto regulation, because it's not just the responsibility of one country.
Right.
If one country has some optimal set of regulation, those can be easily sidelined or bypassed because of the technology, because now everything is,
absolutely.
with cross-border capital flows, it's easily possible to circumvent those regulations. So that is why what's important is to have some agreement on a more consistent approach towards crypto regulations. So therefore, the Financial Stability Board and IMF, these two standard setting bodies were requested to issue documents on how to regulate, what are the various areas to regulate,
Right.
because there are multiple areas. Money laundering is one, capital flows, consumer protection, prudential regulation, financial stability. So on all these issues, we need some consensus on what will be the regulatory framework.
Right.
So what till now is happening is that IMF's mandate is more macro financial,
Yes.
whereas Financial Stability Board's attention or focus is on financial stability. So what India requested was these two institutions should come together and come out with a synthesis paper, a joint
Right.
paper, which will address both the macro financial and the financial stability concern,
Yeah.
and also focus on issues that face the emerging economies, because emerging economies have different set of challenges. Their currencies are more vulnerable. Their capital account framework is separate from how the advanced economies function. So focus should be on addressing the additional set of challenges that emerging and developing economies face. So now we know that the IMF and FSB have issued a synthesis paper. It's being
Right.
circulated,
Yes.
and it will be in public domain. And I think on this we will have some consensus on how to regulate, because this paper is supposed to provide a roadmap for regulating cryptocurrencies in a
Right.
more coordinated manner. So
And then after that, individual countries will kind of mold their
Mold
regulation
them, yes.
according to this.
but at least there will be a general consensus on what are the areas on which regulation is required, and then what are the next steps. Global coordination would be
Right.
required. Some instances of cross-border payments need to be addressed. So all those things are the next steps. So at least if there's consensus on the roadmap for global cryptocurrency regulation, that will be another achievement of the G20 presidency under India.
So there, I mean, for all you crypto enthusiasts, I mean, that's really good news, right? There's light at the end of this tunnel. You'll finally have a rule-based system under which cryptocurrency transactions may be allowed. So let's see how the regulations turn out, but at least there's light at the end of this tunnel. Now, the fourth issue that you raised was
Right.
digital public infrastructure.
Right.
Now, we know that India has actually been talking a lot about this,
Yeah.
but you also mentioned something interesting, that there's some pushback from the advanced economies.
Yes.
Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, the pushback is firstly, they feel that it will harm their private sector players. So that is,
Okay.
it will lead to competition for private sector players. And secondly, there are where some issues that are more relevant or advanced economies are more serious about is the data privacy and data governance.
Right,
so
of course.
they are more sensitive to these issues that, for having a digital public infrastructure, we need to share our personal information.
Mhm.
So whether advanced economies and are they okay with sharing that personal information, at what level? So it requires a more nuanced discussion on data privacy, data governance, intellectual property rights, and also the state of the private payment providers who are working in their country. So those are some of the concerns. So I think on this, there will be some resistance, and it might not be part of the communique in that way, but maybe they would say that interoperability is a long-term goal. So something
Right.
on that respect, but definitely they understand the digital public infrastructure holds important promise for financial inclusion, but advanced economies have their own set of concerns, and unless those are addressed, it's unlikely that we'll see much progress, at least on this front.
Okay, and so now we have a few questions from the audience. Aditya asks that he acknowledges that it's obviously going to be difficult to discuss an alternate currency to the US dollar while the US is part of the discussions.
Right.
But he's asking, do you think that China will push for something like this during the G20 summit, since it has already raised the issue in other areas, like say the BRICS summit?
Yeah, so China has raised this issue in BRICS summit, and it's through other ways they are accelerating this trend towards non-US either trade or payments, etc. But I don't think that will be part of the G20 platform or G20 discussion, because it will create friction. And so I think what India has already made clear what are its agenda, the agenda items, and we've talked about those. So I think there will be more discussion on those areas, and especially the areas that confront the global south. So this issue would not find place in discussions, especially in the G20 platform, but in other platforms where US is not a part, but other emerging economies are a part. And those issues, those developments are happening separately. We have seen India, UAE entering into a agreement to trade in local currencies. So those developments are taking place, but they are unlikely to be part of the G20 discussions.
Right. And now N. Shekhar asks a very ambitious question, but I find it very interesting. He asks, can we have an FTA with all the G20 countries? And in what way will it affect us? And also, can we link up the FTAs with the export of Indian manpower?
So we are already having FTA negotiations with a number of countries separately.
I think he means like G20 as a bloc enters into some sort of...
Yeah, I think that will be difficult. We are having separately, like India, UK, India, EU. So that is happening. But for each FTA, we need to see our own comparative advantage. We need to study the trade data in great detail. What are the areas? What are the segments that would get impacted? Are we willing to take that risk? So I think that is a more calibrated, nuanced discussion that needs to happen with each country separately, rather than, because it's a diversified set. G20 countries are diversified set. It has advanced economies, it has some emerging economies. So depending upon what is our trade composition and what is our equation in terms of foreign investment flows, the discussion needs to be nuanced with each country individually. So that is the thing.
So just as in the recently concluded the ASEAN summit, where the Prime Minister also went, one of the things that they did discuss, or at least that's what the Indian contingent said that they would discuss, is the free trade agreement that India has with the ASEAN countries. So like this, each of the FTAs will be discussed, but not at this summit at a kind of, full level of all 20 countries sitting together and talking about them. And so now Sankalp asks a question about, well, first he goes into how earlier the US hegemony was kind of tough to push back against, but now with the rise of China and a few inward-looking steps that the US has taken, is it likely that during this upcoming summit, the other 19 countries are going to push back against the US, saying that, why are you turning inwards like this, and, finding fault with them?
I think that is not just US. US will raise the same concern with India, that India, why you are turning inward. I think one of the contentious issue is the imposition of duties on laptop and tablet trades, etc.
That we've been doing.
We have been doing. So I think that's a very contentious issue, which is not just particular to the US, but many countries have adopted. India has done that for rice exports. We have imposed duties, wheat exports, and you've seen that rice price internationally has risen multiple times because of the export duty that India has imposed, and for which India has come under sharp criticism, because it has caused a lot of distress for other countries that depend on India for rice export. similarly for wheat, similarly for some of the other food items. So I think that is not something which will be discussed in the G20 summit as such.
Because everybody can point fingers at everybody else.
Yes, but
Right.
on the sidelines, I think India and US, when they will have separate meetings, which they are expected to have on the sidelines of the G20 summit with different leaders, I think this is one of the issues that the US in turn will take up with India, that, whether this is a right step to impose duties, ad hoc duties on
Right.
computers, laptops. And so this is going to be an issue. This is a stumbling block, but this will not be discussed on the broader G20 platform, but could be discussed on the sideline. Similarly, India-UK FTA will also be discussed separately, but
Right.
not as part of the G20 platform. So there are a number of issues that are lined up for discussion, but the 4 key issues that will be discussed under the G20 are what we discussed during this session.
Right. So there you go. I mean, the 4 topics, the 4 issues that Radhika just mentioned. One is the debt distress that happened to a lot of countries post-COVID, how to mitigate that, how to help these countries get out of this distress. The second is the reform of the multilateral developmental banks, how to help them, or how to encourage them to give loans to countries that need it, not be so conservative in their lending practices. The third is, of course, crypto regulations. And finally, we might see some international crypto regulation, at least agreement on it, so that then all the individual countries can go and tweak their own regulations, come out with their own regulations. And the fourth is to do with digital public infrastructure. India is pushing quite hard because we've done a lot of good work in this area. And there are a lot of countries that are keen to adopt what we have done. But there are also some advanced economies that are pushing back, trying to say that, we can't adopt it in its form right now. There might be some tweaks we need to make, some privacy issues that need to be handled. But so these are the issues that are likely to come up in the G20 summit, that is the economic issues that will come up. What actually comes out of the summit, we'll find out only once they're done talking. On that note, that's all we have for you. Thank you so much for watching.